Well, good morning. See you all here. Yes, it's all about war this morning. It just kind of happened. The topic worked, and that's what I thought of. So that's kind of what we're talking about this morning. Hopefully, a good, encouraging discussion, not as depressing as the Lord's Supper talk is, because there's actually some hope at the end of this war, and hopefully, you can see that. War is hell. It's a quote from Civil War General William Sherman, an effective man as he went about his work of conquering the other nation, or the other side of the conflict anyway. And he looks out over these battlefields that are populated with less than living beings, and he looks at those 2% casualty rate victims, and he says, war, the closest thing I can compare it to is hell itself. A horrible thing that we don't want any part of. And yet, if war is so much like hell, which I would agree that's probably a fair statement, if that's the case, God seems to have an odd relationship with it, because he uses war a lot, both literally and figuratively, both actual warfare, and then he talks in metaphors to the people of Israel, and even to us today, in what war is. And he uses war as a picture because it's something we can see. It's a physical reality that's horrible, and yet it communicates a deep message. And so God uses the picture of war to communicate some truths about us as his people, as his workers, as this religion. He is our general. We are his followers. We're his soldiers. And he uses these pictures to communicate with us, to give us images of how we ought to live. And so this morning, we're going to take a look at that, take a look at four different places in the New Testament, ways that God talks about war, looking at how he describes it, and then what our role is in that war. Like the song we sang just before this, who will follow Jesus in the thickest fight, holding up his banner? Right? Who is going to listen to his call? Who's going to listen to his orders? It's military language, and we sing about it sometimes, but we don't often think about it. And so today we get to start by looking at this premise. What kind of war is God talking about? I have the wrong passage marked in my Bible. That's a great start. In 1 Peter 2, you get this picture where Peter is addressing these people. He's writing the book of 1 Peter to strangers and exiles. He's writing it to Jews and Gentiles alike, people who are Christians, no matter their nationality. And he writes to them, and in 1 Peter 2, in verses 4 and 5, he establishes that you Christians are founded on Christ. Right? That's what you're about. You go to Christ, you build your life on Christ. That is the core of your being. There are some people in verses 7 and 8 who don't do that. There are some people who are faithless and don't do that, and they have to face consequences for that reality. But it's in verse 9 that he comes around and he says, you Christians, let me describe you, okay? You Christians, you're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you might proclaim the excellencies, or the praises, or the mercies of the one who called you out of the darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. You have not received mercy once, but now you have received mercy. What language is that using? Does that remind you of any group from the Old Testament, maybe? If I said the chosen race, and I was talking in a biblical context, who would you relate that to? It's the Jewish people of the Old Testament. If I said there's a priesthood involved in this, who would you relate that to? It's the Levites. It's the Jewish people from the Old Testament. A holy nation is the Jewish people. The people for God's possessing, that's the Jews as opposed to the Gentiles. And then in verse 10, you weren't a people, but now you are a people. You didn't have mercy, but now you do have mercy. That's very directly from the opening chapters of Hosea. God reclaiming the Jewish people to be his own. But Peter's addressing Christians here, Jews and Gentiles. And he says it's no longer about the physical reality that it was back in the Jewish days, back in the Old Testament days. Now there's something else going on. You are figuratively the same type of people, where the Jewish separation, where the separation between Jews and Gentiles, it used to be ethnic. It's not anymore. Jews and Gentiles are all Christians, but you are different. You are set apart from other people. While there used to be physical differences, physical signs of the covenant between Jews and Gentiles, now there's not. But there's a spiritual sign of the covenant. All of this Old Testament ideology is realized in New Testament, but it's spiritual instead of physical. And just like that, you have a war that you're fighting. The Old Testament people were embroiled in war, having to win their land back. And look where Peter goes with this example. It's in verse 11. Dear friends, I urge you as strangers and exiles that you abstain from the sinful desires that wage war against your soul, but rather conduct yourself honorably among the Gentiles, the nations around. And then he goes on from there. He uses this picture of old versus new, of physical versus spiritual, and he takes this and he says, hey, I want you all to know there's a war that's happening. I want you all to get this. In verse 11, there is a war that's happening. Now, it's not the physical war that the Israelites used to face, but it is a spiritual war that is much more important. It's a war between sin and faithfulness. It's a war between righteousness and faithlessness. It's a war between God and Satan, and you, living on the battlefield in between the two sides, we have to live through it. And more than that, we're involved in it. Anyone who belongs to God is involved in this war and has to take a side in this war. You got to work for him, or else you're not his people. Do you notice his language in verses 11 and 12? You have a job here. In verse 11, you abstain from sin, right? That's your defenses. You abstain from sin. You don't let evil encroach on your territory. But what do you do in verse 12? You have an offense as well. You go conduct yourself honorably. You go out and do good. You go out and show God to the world. There's a defense, but there's also an offense. This is a fight that you're in. You're in a war here, and the people of God get involved. And we get together and we fight for God, and we go out and we go put forth effort, and we be the soldiers that God called us to be. Because there is a war. He called us to fight in it. And he expects that his people are going to fight in it. But there's a problem. See, he calls us to fight, and then he says, well, it's a war against sinful desires, and it's a war against evil, and it's a war against these spiritual concepts. So tell me, how do I do anything against that? Right? If I'm fighting Satan, if I'm supposed to fight demons, if I'm supposed to fight evil desires, where is that? Right? You give me a person, I can fight a person. You give me an idea, how do I fight an idea? Is there any potential for me to actually succeed against that? If it's Satan himself, he's a lot stronger than I am. Am I even able to do anything against him? I mean, God expects me to fight, but what am I supposed to even be doing here? How am I supposed to accomplish anything? Well, Paul answers that in Ephesians 6. Right? Paul in Ephesians 6, as he's wrapping up Ephesians, the great masterwork that is Ephesians, he's gone through this whole letter. He's given them very lofty goals to do, like, just be faithful in everything. It's some tough stuff. And then he closes out this letter by saying, it's okay because you're not alone. I know this sounds hard. I know this sounds difficult. I know that fighting Satan himself seems like an awfully intimidating thing, but it's okay because you got some help with this. Are you able to fight? Yes. Finally, Ephesians 6 and verse 10, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. You put on the full armor of God, so that you can stand against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood. It's rather against the rulers, and against the powers, and against the world forces of this darkness, against spiritual forces of wickedness that are in the heavenly places. For this reason, you take up the full armor of God, so that you might be able to resist in the evil day, and having done everything, that you stand firm. And then he lists off characteristics that you're supposed to have. There's righteousness, there's faith, there's peace, there's truth, there's salvation, there's the Holy Spirit, there's prayer. You're supposed to take these things into combat with you. But what he says is, firstly, Ephesians, recognize that you are not alone. God gives you strength. And God gives you strength in a very particular way. He gives you some tools. Some tools that you use. He gives you a set of armor. Because you're in a war. Recognize that. You're in a war. He gives you a set of armor so that you can go and be a soldier for him. But it's not just any armor, right? He doesn't give me an actual uniform. He doesn't give me weaponry that I can use here. Because we're not about that. I'm not trying to attack another person. I'm not trying to conquer another nation. It's not that we rouse Santa Clara to go attack Sunnyvale or something like that. It's not that there's a physical conflict that's going on. There's a much deeper spiritual level to all of this. You got to recognize this war, it's a spiritual war. This war is full of spiritual forces on the good side and the bad side, on God's side and Satan's side. There's a lot at stake that's going on here. And so you take up the armor that God gives you. But it's not just the armor that God gives you. No, note that. It's the armor of God. I think this is a really cool idea. Maybe we don't get it all that often. This is the armor of God. You know another way to say that? This is God's armor that he used. When Jesus came to earth, was he fighting a war? Was he fighting a battle, do you think, for God? Yeah. Yeah, he was. What did he use? Did he use truth? Did he bring peace? Did he bring the sword of the Spirit in both his words and his actions? Does he bring salvation? He equips himself with righteousness and faith. Jesus uses this armor, and he's perfect. And he defeats Satan, and he defeats death itself, and he fights through everything, and he wins everything at the end of it. And then when he's passing on, as we read in the scripture reading earlier, in the Great Commission, what is he doing? But he's handing his armor to the next generation, and he's saying, you apostles of mine, now you go give this to other people. This is God's equipment that he's handed to humans. And he said, you can use this to be just as good as I am. We get to be like God and use his strength to help us. Because we're sure not going to win this battle on our own. But with God's support, we can indeed win it. And why is it? It's because it's a spiritual one. It's not a physical one. I don't have to be in perfect shape. I don't have to be the strongest or be the best tactician. I don't have to have all of these different benefits that you would need as a soldier. I've got God. And that means I can conquer. You've got God. And that means you can conquer as well. Our struggle isn't against flesh and blood. It's not against other people. It's against rulers and powers and world forces of darkness and spiritual forces of wickedness that are all throughout the heavenly places. It's about concepts and evil ideas, and it's about Satan himself. But God defeated Satan, and God gives you his same tools to go and defeat Satan as well. Put on that armor of God. Put on Jesus' armor. And it's all going to work out just fine. What does Paul say? He says, you need to use God's tools. Yes, there is a fight going on. Yes, there is a war, and you are called to work in it. But it's okay. You're going to be able to fight in this war because God's equipped you. It's not that God's just throwing you in the front lines and kind of saying, good luck. It's that God equips you fully. He kits you out. He gets you everything. And then he takes you and he stands with you as a soldier so that you can go and do the work that you are supposed to. Fight for God. And yes, you can use God's own weaponry to do so. But okay, what's the purpose to this war then? If I'm not attacking, what am I aiming for? What am I trying to accomplish here? Right? If you give me a city to conquer, okay, I know how to do that because it's a physical goal, it's very achievable, it's right there, and I can go and do it. If you give me a nation to beat, I can do that because there's a measurable goal here. There's a founded idea that I'm going to take this patch of land and then I go and achieve it. What's the purpose of this war? If there's no lands to get, what's the purpose of this war? What are we fighting against exactly? If it's not a nation, if it's not a people, what exactly are we fighting against? How do we use these tools that God's equipped us with? Paul tells you that a couple books earlier. In 2 Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians 10, Paul is answering a different question, and he's not specifically talking about this, but he uses the language that turns into this idea. In 2 Corinthians, there are people who are doubting Paul, who are questioning him, because these people come up in full suit and tie, and they come up very impressively, and they use like exaggerated verbiage, which is they use long words. They're trying to be really impressive and show off for people, and then they say, Paul doesn't do that. Paul's not as fancy, he doesn't dress as well, he doesn't speak as well, he's not as like exciting as we are. Paul's not any good. You look at him, and he doesn't look like much. And Paul says, yeah, but that's fine. Because in 2 Corinthians 10, in verse 3, he says, look, although we live according to the flesh, although I am here and you see me, we don't wage war according to the flesh. It doesn't matter how good I look, because it's not about the flesh. What is it about? It's in 2 Corinthians 10 in verse 4. Although we live in the flesh, we don't wage war according to the flesh, since the weapons of our warfare, they're not of the flesh, but rather are powerful through God for the demolition of strongholds. We demolish arguments and every proud thing that is raised up against the knowledge of God. We take every thought captive to obey Christ. We are ready to punish any disobedience once your obedience is complete. But you are looking at things outwardly. What does he say? He says, this war is spiritual. You're looking at things outwardly. You're looking at things from the physical appearance, but that doesn't actually matter. You're missing the point if you're looking at the outside. You're missing the point if you're looking at other people or other nations and you're trying to find a target in that way. That's not the war we're fighting. We're fighting a spiritual war, one in which we demolish strongholds in verse 4. What does that mean exactly? What's he trying to communicate there? We demolish strongholds in verse 4. We demolish arguments. That's what he comes around to. We destroy falsehood. We're not against people. We're not against nations. We're not against another city. No, in this war, God's not calling us to go and hurt anyone. God's calling us to pay attention to Satan's arguments that are out in the world. God's calling us to pay attention to when Satan has convinced some people that sin, it's okay. You can do it, or you can overlook it, or you can just ignore it, and it's all going to be okay. We destroy that falsehood. We don't stand for that. This is when Satan has convinced someone that it's okay to not come to church. It's okay to lie a bit. It's okay to gossip. It's okay to steal just a little bit on the side because it's just a little bit. We don't stand for that. God's truth destroys falsehood. This is what we're combating, not people, but false ideas and Satan's influence upon the world. And the language he uses here in verse 4 is just amazing. The demolition of strongholds. What does that look like to you? Can you get a picture of that in your head? When I'm thinking demolishing strongholds, the Death Star from A New Hope, right? Star Wars Episode 4, the Death Star, gone. That's demolishing a stronghold. Or Helm's Deep from Lord of the Rings, when they blow the hole in the middle of it. That's demolishing a stronghold. We open up an argument, we rip it apart, so that truth can do its work, and so that good things can come in instead. We demolish those strongholds, those fortifications, all the people who have everything on their side. We're scientists, we don't believe in God. Yeah, well, let's talk about that. Let's have a conversation, because we can destroy those arguments with the truth that's found here. We can destroy falsehood because God equips us with the truth. But what does that require of you? That requires that you start focusing on the spiritual. Because you can't just look at another person and say, all right, I'm going to fight him. You have to look at another person and say, this is the problem that they're dealing with. How can I best help them? How can I best fight Satan? It's not about hurting other people. It's about getting rid of Satan from their lives so they can be free as well. This combat is about ideas and not about physical people. Stop focusing on the physical. And you start focusing on the spiritual. You start to look deeper. Because God's people do go to war. We are equipped to go to war. We go to war with these false ideas. So where does that leave us? Right? How do you get started? I know what I'm supposed to do. I know that I'm able to do it. I know that God wants me to do it. But how do I actually get started to start in this war, to begin the fight? Well, let's talk about participation for just a second. And you know what's important here? It's in that Great Commission that we read right before this. Jesus comes, he's about to leave, and he says to his followers, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Do you know what that means? That means he's the general, he's the commander-in-chief, and he gets to tell us what to do, okay? Where does he say start? You go. You make disciples. You baptize them, you convert them, and you teach them. You want to know where to start in this war? Go find somebody else and go lead them to Christ. There are a lot of people out there who are missing Jesus in their lives, who are missing God, and who don't have access to Him. There are a lot of people out there who don't know who God is, especially in this culture. Right? Back in Kentucky, it's a different story. Everybody vaguely knows who God is, but they don't care. Here, people haven't heard. And people don't even know that. But as Jesus leaves, his commands are, you want to get started, you want to start working, you want to do something for me, go conquer people. Go fight the evil ideas. Go fight Satan's hold that he has on society, on culture, on the individuals in your workplace or in your family or whoever it may be. Go fight Satan's hold. Help them and hurt the devil. Go save them and harm evil. Go love them and hate falsehood. Go do good to them because that's what you'd want them to do to you. God calls us to war. He's equipped us for everything. He's given us a purpose, and he even allows us to fight for him. And that in itself is a huge blessing. It's a responsibility, but it's a huge blessing that we don't even often think about. You go out and you go conquer. How does war look today? It's a little bit different than it used to be, and it's a little bit different than even most people think of it, because we're not hurting people. We're helping them. God wants his Christians to march on the world to go conquer it. We're not conquering one nation, we're conquering all of them. We're not trying to get one people in line with our government, with God, our ruler. We're going after all of them. It's a worldwide conquest that Jesus is calling for. It's a worldwide dominion that he's seeking to establish. And God calls his people to go and fight for him. But we don't use swords. We use salvation. We don't use our personal powers. We use God's grace in this fight. When you look at a physical war, like William Sherman, you might well say that war is hell. It is a hellish place where we don't want to be because of all the destruction, because of all the horrors that are there. And with this spiritual war, it's the same way. There is a hell that I don't want to go to. And I don't want anyone else to suffer that either. God calls us to help people escape that. Our result is heaven. That's what we're fighting for, that's what we're fighting towards, and that's what we're trying to bring other people to. Do you want to go to war? I don't want to go march into some foreign country, but I do want to go and help people find God. That's the call of a Christian. That's a Christian's responsibility, is to go and fight for the Lord in every situation, in every instance, for every person, for every life. You go and you fight for God, because that's what he's called you to. Is there a way we can help you get that process started? Do you need to start fighting for other people, or do you need to start the fight yourself? If there's anything we can do for you spiritually, if there's any help that you need, I'll be right up here, and you're free to talk to me as we're standing and singing the song.